Now you know the truth about spiritual warfare in everyday life. Every morning before your feet touch the floor, the first battle has already begun. You don't hear explosions, but your thoughts are already firing. You don't see soldiers, but your emotions are already under siege. It begins in silence, a whisper that says you're not enough, a distraction that pulls your focus, a wave of exhaustion that feels too heavy to explain. Most people call it stress, but what if it's something deeper, something that moves through the unseen spaces of your consciousness, quietly shaping the course of your day? Spiritual warfare isn't a myth from an ancient text. It's a psychological and spiritual phenomenon that unfolds in real time, within the circuitry of your mind and the chemistry of your body. The enemy doesn't come to destroy your body. He comes to disorganize your focus, distort your perception, and detach you from the awareness of who you really are. And he does it subtly, using your own neural patterns as his battlefield. The modern world has made this war harder to see. The screens, the noise, the constant stimulation, they don't just distract you, they desensitize you. They make the invisible war feel like ordinary life. Yet beneath every feeling of anxiety, every burst of anger, every moment of despair, there's a deeper current of resistance. Something sacred inside you is being tested. Something divine is trying to awaken. In this journey, we're going to expose that war, not to create fear, but to bring understanding. You'll see how neuroscience, psychology, and ancient wisdom converge to reveal one truth: awareness is the ultimate weapon. When the mind awakens to the patterns of darkness, it stops being the battlefield and becomes the light itself. The invisible morning war. The first moments after you wake up define the spiritual temperature of your entire day. It's the quietest part of your routine, yet it's when the mind is most vulnerable, suspended between the stillness of sleep and the noise of reality. What most people call morning fog is, in truth, the opening battle of the invisible war. It's when your brain, still releasing cortisol to regain alertness, is flooded with thoughts that seek to anchor your emotional direction. Before you've even left your bed, two voices begin to negotiate for your attention, one rooted in peace and another disguised as anxiety, distraction, and urgency. This is where spiritual warfare hides, in the micro decisions of how you begin. Whether you reach for your phone or take a moment of silence, whether you breathe with awareness or rush to consume information, you are already choosing sides. The mind's architecture is built to follow the momentum of the first focus you give it. Neuroscientifically, that's how dopamine pathways are reinforced. Spiritually, that's how faith or fear begins to take control. Imagine the mind as a doorway. Each morning, something waits to step through, clarity or confusion. Most people think they're making neutral choices, but in reality, they're opening gates. When you start your day feeding your mind chaos, you're not just losing time, you're surrendering territory. But when you begin with stillness, gratitude, and presence, you reclaim the first stronghold of awareness. The invisible morning war is won not by doing more, but by remembering who you are before the world tells you who to be. Each sunrise is a call to arms, a sacred reminder that peace is not passive. It's a daily decision. When silence screams. There are moments when life grows so still that it feels almost deafening. You sit alone, the noise fades, and yet something inside you begins to ache. That emptiness, that tension in the chest, that whisper that something is wrong. It's not always depression or fatigue. Sometimes it's the echo of spiritual warfare disguised as silence. The mind, conditioned to constant stimulation, begins to panic when peace arrives. It confuses stillness with danger, because in silence, truth has room to speak, and truth often exposes what we've been avoiding. In cognitive terms, this is the moment when the brain's default mode network activates, the system that processes identity, memory, and emotion. When untrained, it loops into self-criticism and doubt. But when trained, it becomes the gateway to deep self-awareness. Spiritually, it's the same mechanism through which divine insight emerges. The problem is that most people run from it. They fill the silence before it reveals too much. But silence, when faced instead of feared, becomes sacred. It unmasks what truly governs your thoughts. It shows whether your peace is genuine or merely the absence of noise. It's in this inner quiet that you begin to perceive the invisible tension, the spiritual friction between the person you are and the awareness trying to emerge. When silence screams, it's not punishing you. It's inviting you to listen. The soul doesn't shout. It waits for you to stop running. And when you finally do, the noise that once felt unbearable becomes the language of awakening, the subtle language of shadows. Darkness never introduces itself directly. It doesn't shout, it whispers. It doesn't command, it suggests. It slides into your thoughts disguised as reason, wrapped in logic, cloaked in familiarity. You don't even notice it entering. You just begin to feel slightly more irritated, more uncertain, more disconnected from yourself. This is how the subtle language of shadows operates, through thoughts that sound like your own voice, but carry an emotional weight that isn't yours. Cognitive psychology calls this automatic thinking, the mental autopilot that filters your perception of reality. Spiritually, it's the oldest form of deception. The mind speaking lies through the tone of truth. You hear it when a single mistake turns into a narrative of failure. You feel it when one moment of doubt becomes an entire day of discouragement. The enemy doesn't need to destroy you. He just needs to convince you that you're already broken. But here lies the secret. Awareness neutralizes suggestion. The moment you recognize that not every thought deserves your agreement, the illusion loses power. Shadows survive only where you don't look. The more you observe them, the more you bring light into the unconscious, the weaker they become. So the next time a voice tells you you're unworthy, don't argue. Observe. Don't engage the lie. Expose it. Spiritual warfare often sounds like reasoning because darkness learned to mimic intelligence. Your task is not to silence your mind. It's to discern the difference between your true voice and the one trained to keep you small. The architecture of the mind under siege. When the mind is under spiritual pressure, it begins to restructure itself, not metaphorically, literally. Every repeated thought leaves a physical imprint on your brain's neural map. The more a certain pattern is fired, the stronger its connection becomes. This is neuroplasticity at work, but when fear and distraction dominate those pathways, they start building what could be called a fortress of distortion, a stronghold made not of stone, but of repetitive thoughts. Stress hormones like cortisol flood your system, keeping your brain in survival mode. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for clarity, decision-making, and moral reasoning, weakens under constant tension. The amygdala, which governs fear and emotional reactivity, takes control. Spiritually speaking, the battlefield shifts from the external world to the architecture of your own perception. The enemy doesn't need to invade. He just needs you to believe the invasion already happened. That's why confusion feels so heavy, because your own neural circuits are firing against you. What was once calm becomes chaos. What was once trust becomes hesitation. And yet, the same mechanism that builds the fortress can also dismantle it. When you begin replacing anxious repetition with mindful awareness, prayer, or gratitude, you start rewiring the architecture from the inside out. This is where science and faith converge. Awareness is not passive, it's reconstruction. Every moment you choose calm over chaos, you're literally reshaping your brain's defense system. The siege ends the moment you stop reacting and start rebuilding. The emotional hijack. There are moments when emotions rise so suddenly they feel uncontrollable, a rush of anger, fear, or despair that floods the body before the mind can intervene. In psychology, this is called an emotional hijack, but in the spiritual dimension, it's often the most common battlefield of all. The invisible enemy doesn't always attack through circumstances. He strikes through emotion, using your own biology as a weapon. When your brain perceives threat, even a psychological one, the amygdala triggers a cascade of chemical reactions. Adrenaline surges, heart rate climbs, vision narrows. Your body prepares for war, even if there's no real danger. This response is ancient, designed for survival, but in modern life it's constantly misused. Every argument, every disappointment, every unhealed wound can reawaken the body's alarm system. Spiritually, this moment is exploited, because in the flood of reaction you lose awareness. You speak words you don't mean, make choices that hurt you, and forget who you are. Yet the same biology that betrays you can also be trained to protect you. Breathing slowly, grounding your focus, praying in the middle of the storm, these acts are not small. They reset the nervous system. They teach your brain that not every emotional fire needs to be fed. Over time, this rewiring transforms emotional reactivity into emotional mastery. The true act of spiritual warfare isn't suppressing emotion, it's reclaiming authorship over it. You were never meant to be ruled by chemical storms, but to understand them, to stand in the center of the hurricane and remain unmoved. Invisible algorithms of darkness. Every day, without noticing, you're being studied, not only by machines, but by forces that understand how your mind works. Algorithms, both digital and spiritual, learn your habits. They observe your fears, track your attention, and feed you exactly what keeps you distracted. You scroll endlessly, not because you want to, but because something designed that craving. The same principle applies to the unseen. Spiritual warfare doesn't always appear as temptation. Sometimes it disguises itself as entertainment, comfort, or productivity. Your phone learns your preferences through data. The darker side of awareness learns through your repetition. Every time you surrender to distraction, you're programming the invisible system that governs your mental focus. It knows when to strike. When you're tired, lonely, or seeking validation, it doesn't need to attack your beliefs, it simply diverts your attention from them. Neuroscientifically, this works through dopamine manipulation, the brain's reward chemical being hijacked by overstimulation. Spiritually, it's far deeper. Every scroll, every unnecessary comparison, every emotional click is a transaction of energy. You trade clarity for noise, presence for illusion, peace for impulse, but awareness breaks the code. The moment you recognize that your attention is sacred, the algorithm loses its power. Spiritual resistance in this context means living intentionally, choosing what you consume instead of being consumed by it. The battlefield isn't your screen, it's your awareness of who's controlling it. The more conscious you become, the more the system collapses, because it can't manipulate a mind that's awake. The spiritual fog of modern life. The modern world doesn't need to destroy your faith to weaken it. It only needs to keep you busy. Constant notifications, endless deadlines, and the pressure to stay productive create a kind of fog that slowly dulls your spiritual senses. You begin each day moving faster, yet feeling emptier. Your attention becomes fragmented, your peace outsourced to screens, and silence starts to feel unbearable. This is not accidental, it's a perfectly designed environment for spiritual fatigue. The human brain was never built for this level of stimulation. Every alert, every ping, every surge of dopamine pulls you deeper into mental fragmentation. Over time, your nervous system adapts to chaos, mistaking stress for normalcy. Spiritually, this fog disconnects you from awareness, the very space where divine intuition speaks. You stop feeling subtle shifts in energy, the quiet conviction of truth, the internal compass that once guided your decisions. This is the most effective form of spiritual warfare today. Not visible evil, but distraction disguised as progress. The fog makes you forget what matters, and once you forget, you no longer resist. The antidote is not isolation, but recalibration. Slowing down becomes an act of rebellion. Presence becomes warfare. Every moment you reclaim from noise is a small resurrection of clarity. The fog will always exist, but you decide whether to live lost in it or rise above it. The moment you choose awareness over rush, the modern world's strongest weapon, distraction, loses its aim. The inner saboteur. Sometimes the most relentless enemy doesn't come from the outside, it lives within. The inner saboteur is the echo of past wounds, unfinished grief, and learned self-criticism. It wears your voice, uses your memories, and speaks in tones of logic that seem perfectly reasonable. But underneath its reasoning lies a single purpose: to keep you from evolving. The battle with this voice is the most intimate form of spiritual warfare because it hides behind the illusion of self-awareness. You think you're being realistic when, in truth, you're being restrained. From a psychological lens, this is the internalized critic, formed through early experiences, reinforced through repetition, and rooted in shame. But in the spiritual dimension, it's more than psychology. It's the shadow's attempt to preserve identity. Every time you try to grow, the saboteur whispers that you're not ready, not capable, not enough. It convinces you to stop before you begin. This war isn't won by suppression, but by exposure. You dismantle the inner saboteur by bringing it to light, naming its lies, and confronting the emotional residues it feeds on. Healing then becomes an act of defiance. Each step of forgiveness, toward others, toward yourself, starves the shadow of its power. Spiritual maturity begins when you stop asking, "What's wrong with me?" and start asking, "Who taught me to think that way?" Once you see the saboteur for what it is, a frightened echo trying to protect an outdated version of you, it loses its hold. The war within becomes the birthplace of peace, the resistance of light. Light does not fight darkness with force. It dissolves it through presence. Every act of awareness, kindness, or forgiveness radiates a frequency that darkness cannot imitate or endure. Resistance in spiritual warfare isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet, deliberate, and profoundly human. When you choose compassion over bitterness, patience over anger, faith over fear, you're engaging in the purest form of rebellion against the unseen forces that feed on confusion. In psychological terms, this is emotional regulation. In spiritual terms, it's warfare by alignment. Darkness survives through reaction. It needs chaos to multiply. Every time you pause before responding, every time you refuse to mirror aggression, you disrupt that cycle. You become the interruption. That stillness, that choice to respond rather than react, rewires both your neural pathways and your spiritual authority. The resistance of light isn't about pretending life is easy. It's about maintaining clarity when everything around you tries to distort it. It's the discipline of staying anchored in truth while the world trembles with noise. Light is not fragile. It is structure. It organizes chaos. It reveals. It heals. Each small act of light weakens the architecture of darkness. Even your quiet persistence, your gentle self-control, your willingness to forgive, these are not passive traits, they are weapons. You resist not by hating the dark, but by refusing to become it. Spiritual neuroplasticity. The mind is not static. Every thought, every prayer, every repeated emotion shapes its physical structure. Neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to rewire itself, is one of the most profound mirrors of divine design. It proves that transformation is not only spiritual, it's biological. Faith, gratitude, and intention are not abstract virtues. They're signals that sculpt the brain, forming new neural pathways that sustain peace, focus, and resilience. When you pray or meditate, you're not just speaking to the divine, you're training your brain to access calm and clarity on command. The prefrontal cortex strengthens, the amygdala quiets, and your nervous system learns the rhythm of trust. Over time, the body begins to respond to peace as if it were survival itself. This is spiritual neuroplasticity, the harmony between belief and biology. The enemy of this process is repetition of negativity. Every time you feed fear, you reinforce its circuitry. Every time you feed faith, you build a new one. Awareness turns into engineering. Thoughts become architecture. You are literally rewiring your perception of reality. This truth bridges science and spirit. It reminds you that you are not trapped by who you've been. Your brain and your soul are designed to evolve together. What you focus on, you become. The war may begin in thought, but the victory is written in the structure of the mind that learns to believe differently. The weapons of stillness. Stillness is often misunderstood as weakness, but in truth, it's the highest form of precision. It's where clarity sharpens and the mind returns to alignment with the spirit. In a world addicted to reaction, silence becomes a strategy of strength. Every moment you pause before responding, every time you breathe before speaking, you're reclaiming the authority that distraction tried to steal. The weapon of stillness isn't absence of motion, it's the mastery of it. When the body is still, the nervous system recalibrates, the brain's chaos begins to settle, and the heart's rhythm synchronizes with a higher order. This is not passivity, it's preparation. In the same way that a warrior sharpens his blade before battle, silence sharpens awareness before decision. You stop being a victim of your emotions and become their observer. This shift changes everything because awareness cannot be manipulated. Spiritually, stillness opens the inner sanctuary, that space where divine intuition speaks without language. It's where truth becomes self-evident. Psychologically, it's the restoration of executive control, the regaining of the mind's throne from impulsive emotion. When you cultivate stillness, you stop fighting on the enemy's terms. You stop reacting to chaos and start governing it. True strength is quiet. True power doesn't need noise. When you master stillness, your presence itself becomes disruptive to darkness because nothing can influence what is anchored in peace. The return of authority. Authority isn't control over others, it's mastery over attention. Every spiritual battle you face begins and ends in your awareness. Whoever owns your focus owns your mind. The reason darkness thrives is not because it's powerful, but because it's persuasive. It convinces you to look away from light, to feed distraction, to chase validation instead of truth. The return of authority happens when you remember that your consciousness is not a passive screen. It's the command center of your entire reality. From a psychological perspective, this is the awakening of executive function, the part of your brain that decides what matters. From a spiritual one, it's reclaiming dominion over the garden of your mind. The serpent never forced Eve to eat the fruit. It simply redirected her focus. Every day, that same mechanism repeats. You lose peace not by force, but by misdirection. To return to authority, you must practice awareness like a discipline. Guard your attention as if it were sacred currency, because it is. Every thought you accept becomes architecture. Every belief you rehearse becomes law within your inner world. When you master focus, you master energy. When you master energy, you master reality. This is not arrogance, it's remembrance. You were designed to govern your mind, not to be governed by it. Authority isn't reclaimed through domination, but through alignment, with truth, with peace, with divine order. Once you realize that nothing external has the right to rule your inner state, the war begins to lose its hold because you've already taken back the throne, the revelation of victory. Victory was never meant to be a dramatic conquest. It was meant to be a quiet awakening. The true end of spiritual warfare is not when darkness disappears, but when you finally recognize it for what it is, powerless in the presence of awareness. The war was never external. It was fought in perception, in memory, in emotion, in every unseen corner of your consciousness. And the moment you became aware of the pattern, the enemy lost its disguise. This revelation transforms struggle into understanding. What once felt like punishment now becomes preparation. Every disappointment, every setback, every sleepless night was never meant to destroy you. It was meant to train you to see. Awareness itself becomes redemption. You stop fearing the dark because you realize light has always been within you, waiting to be noticed. Neuroscience calls this integration, when the fragmented parts of the self reconnect into wholeness. Spiritually, it's resurrection. The moment your identity aligns with truth, you begin to live from peace, not for it. You no longer seek the end of battle. You embody the wisdom it gave you. The revelation of victory is simple yet profound. The enemy only wins when you forget who you are. But once you remember, once you anchor yourself in the clarity of awareness, the war dissolves into silence, not because the world changed, but because you did. The light that once fought to survive now stands unshaken, radiant, and eternal.